look, it's a pretty daunting task when you get asked to stand in front of the Women in Defence Technology forum, particularly the maiden launch. Jenna, who I've got a lot of respect for, who's running around like a headless chook at the moment making this magic happen, asked me, and I thought, default yes. Always say yes and figure it out later. And so I said, yeah, okay. And months passed, and then COVID hit and it delayed, and I was like, it's all right. Maybe it'll never happen. I don't have to worry about it. Evidently, here we are, okay? And then I thought, well, always assert your relevance and your competence. Try and find your place. Try and demonstrate something of value to everyone you meet. And I thought, well, I could talk about strategy. What's a terrible plan? That's what we've got Dutton for. Why would I do that? I'm not going to do it the justice it deserves. I thought I could talk about technology. Evidently, I'm not well placed to do that compared to some of the people who are speaking today. And I thought, maybe I could try and relate about what it's like to be a female leader in defence. That is not the right path for this discussion. Okay? What I thought about was, what would be of value for an organisation on its maiden launch? I do a lot of work with different companies all around the world. And I thought, something that's often underrated or underestimated is the power of story. All right? Why are we talking about story here? Well, I thought, leaders coordinate change. That's what they do. Well, there's nothing more powerful than story to achieve something of that effect. And so I thought, let's go down this path. Let's dig apart what story is. Link it to women in defence technology. Talk about narrative and talk about the efficacy about how we transfer our message to people in a way that actually lands and actually gives it the strength it needs to go to the next level. Does that seem like a reasonable prospect? I got one nod and I'm okay with it. All right. I want to introduce a group of people called the Newsies. 1899. Our setting is set. We're in New York, predominantly around the Brooklyn area. Our Newsies, aged between 6 all the way through to 20 years of age, but predominantly around 13 years of age, work in the city, standing on the corners of streets, delivering news to the people walking past. They buy newspapers from 2 major newspaper providers. We'll call them the newspaper moguls for our purpose. And then what they do is they buy it and they sell it. That's the reader, read all about it. These are our cats. Now, before these people would become famous, 5,000 trolley workers would go on strike pertaining to issues about pay and conditions. It was a bubble and double in trouble. And we found that the trolley workers got to the stage of riots, heavy protests, to the point that the National Guard actually had to be called in order to allay any of the concerns that were actually developing. Well, whilst this was happening, our newsies were delivering the news, and they were watching with bated breath. Suddenly a war kicks off in Spanish waters, and suddenly our newsies get a price jack from 50 cents to 60 cents in the back end. That might not seem like a lot, but when your margins are very small and you live on the corner of impoverishment yourself and homelessness in many cases, and in many regards these were providers for their families, it's a very relevant piece of information. And so they pushed back, and we have our first sense of conflict. Thus enters the scene Lewis Ballot, also known as Kid Blink because of his cool-ass eye patch. He's blind in one eye, he's 13 years of age, and he's a natural leader. Very disgusted with the rise in prices from these particular newspapers, Kid Blink pushed back. He rallied the masses of newsies and single-handedly coordinated the largest children's strike ever in the existence of the US up until that point. How did he do it? Well, he used story. And he used story in a very profound way. Very intuitive to Kid, but skills that we can take with us nonetheless. And he stood before the masses on the Brooklyn Bridge and as well as a number of theatres around the city. And he stood there and he presented. And his speech said, look, and I'll abbreviate, look, if the millionaires can't afford to lose 10 cents, why can we? What a powerful narrative to bring people along for the journey. And the boycott held. Now, I bet you're just dying to know what happens next, but that's called suspense, and I'll get to that later. Team, we have a very powerful system in our body called the endocrine system. For all intensive purposes, we can think of it as the chemical factory of our body. It's the hormone production. When we feel a one-on-one connection with our characters, with our people, with our staff, we see the early development of oxytocin. A mother holding her child for the first time is the largest recorded surges of oxytocin that we've ever read. Okay? Oxytocin, for all intents and purposes, is also known as the love drug. When we feel connection and stability, but more importantly, an interconnection with a team, i.e. we feel like we've found our place in the world, or we found our place in the team that we wanted to be a part of, we see a surge in serotonin, a general feeling of euphoria. When we have a reward, we feel dopamine, also known as the expectation of reward drug, that feeling before you get on a roller coaster as opposed to the feeling on it. But on the other side, we also have conflict. We have tension. And when we have tension and we have uncertainty, we see the release of cortisol, the drug that promotes our fight, flight, and freeze response. Very, very powerful drug. And then we see adrenaline bolted on behind that. Cortisol makes the decision. Adrenaline provides the fuel to base the decision. This chemical construct is how we feel the world. And Maya Angelou said, people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. But they will never forget the way that you made them feel. This is the system that makes that so. Let me go back one here. 100,000 years ago, we started seeing the early signs of speech. 40,000 years ago, we saw the first development of pictographs in the form of cave paintings. 6,000 years ago, we see the first finely tuned articulation of language written down. And now we have social media. The mechanism by which we've used story has changed, but the power and the effect and the need for it has not. Why is that relevant for women in defense technology? Why would that be relevant? Well, I put it to you that if we can't get our story and our narrative correctly at this stage and this junction, then we risk losing the potential to bring people along for that journey. What an opportunity it is right now to articulate what it is we're trying to achieve, what are we doing here, and how we're going to do it. I originally framed my discussion leaders and communication, where both intent and delivery matter. It's slightly misleading. I'm going to focus predominantly on delivery. I think that's where we're going to have the biggest bang for buck. So I put it to the floor. Who is telling our story and what are they saying? I ask this of all the organizations I work with. I ask it of all my coaching clients. Who is telling our story and what are they saying? The concept of objectivity is a terrifying prospect because it's outside of our hands sometimes, and sometimes someone's telling our story in a way that's not resourceful to the intent that we originally went for. Has anyone ever seen that? Where you're like, oh my God, that is not what we wanted. What are people saying about us? When we refer back to the story of our 1899 Newsies, they used the power of story in order to incite the masses. They single-handedly stopped the entire revenue of the two largest news production companies in the entire planet at the time. And they did it overnight. Power of story. Our stories evidently have a construct that remains extant as a framework for all of them. We have our plot, the where and the when, generally speaking. We have our conflict, that uncomfortable feeling, the production of cortisol, like I mentioned before. We have the inevitable resolution once we finally get over that hurdle or the conflict itself. We have our perspectives, our context, and our morals. That's the subjective nature of stories. And that is one of the variables where sometimes we lose our way and we lose our influence. We have our setting, where it's located, and the boundaries. And we have our characters. Our characters are our people. And we see each other as a reflective response from each of those characters. I want to go through each of these in a little bit of detail, and I'm going to try and link it back to the Women in Defence Technology so that we as a collective, as the starting point for this amazing initiative, can start to maybe contemplate how we message this and how we actually garner the effect that we're actually trying to seek and achieve. Our setting is our frame of reference. It's the point that we can link back to. If we try and compare the setting from a Stephen King novel versus an Armageddon archaic movie versus a English romantic comedy, we're going to see how powerful setting truly is. I mentioned setting before when I talked about our 1899 Newsies. Well, the question I'd ask you is, how would we frame the setting for women in defence technology? Do we frame it in a positive light? Do we frame it in a light that promotes immediacy or alarm? How we frame it really shapes the direction of where we're going to end up. I propose that women in defence technology might be framed in terms of setting as Peter Dutton just absolutely smashed it out of the ballpark, saying we've had challenges to get to this point. We acknowledge them, and then we've moved forward. And there is an amazing opportunity right now to set an unprecedented level of growth for women in defence. And that might be a message that we can probably latch onto and collectively agree with. Our setting is also the rules of the game. It's the boundaries. It sets how we're going to frame whether we go left or right and how far up and down we go. Now, boundaries are incredibly powerful things from a leadership perspective because there's a misconception that boundaries are a mechanism to hamper freedom. It is quite the opposite. Boundaries will set you free. And to use the example, a game of chess has very definitive rules, very set standards. They're internationally recognized. All of those rules considered, of which there are many, we find ourselves with up to 1 billion different engagements. More rules did not necessarily mean less freedom. And an acknowledgement of that is, what are the rules of the game for how we actually use this organisation and how do we use it to best effect? Apologies. Our characters, and this is where we start talking about leadership. Who are our characters? How would we frame ourselves in the narrative? What do they contribute, and who are the villains? Now, this is where it gets a little complex, because the best authors in the world make our villains very relatable. Once upon a time, they created a character called Superman. Superman no one knew about. No one wanted a bar of him. Why? Because Superman was not relatable. He was unstoppable, his powers were infinite, and he was a borderline god. He won every fight, and he was boring. True. All right? So what they did was they created kryptonite. Why? Because we needed to empathize with Superman. We needed to feel his pain. Empathy is not just rainbows and lollipops all the time. It's empathizing with your enemy. It's trying to put yourself in the shoes of someone else. And the best authors in the world learn the context of the people they're up against in order to contextualize against them and try and understand why do they do the things they do. That's a leadership trait right there. Very, very powerful contribution. Our plot always start with the end in mind. Women in defense technology. What does our end state look like? Can we articulate it? Would we know it when we reached it? Can we answer those questions yet? Maybe not, but now we at least can think about it. What would success look like when we got there? And would we have realized it? Our plot needs to be confronting enough that we understand the sequencing and the sequencing is logical. As the good minister just mentioned, we have experienced phenomenal challenges in defence in garnering talent that support capability. That's what we're up against. We're up against external stakeholders that don't necessarily have our best interests in mind. Elephant in the room, acknowledgement. So what do we need to do in order to acknowledge up until this point, and what does it look like when we move forward? And is the sequencing logical enough that it would make sense? There's nothing worse than a story without a plot, and there's nothing worse than a plot without a purpose. Conflict. What is the problem we're trying to fix? I'll ask it again. What is the problem we're trying to fix? Every organisation I work with, I ask this question. I'm seeing a lot of consultants nodding because evidently they've asked the same question before. What's the problem we're trying to solve? Very hard to articulate sometimes, particularly when things have gotten moving and we've got momentum and things are feeling good and we've got followership and stuff's happening. What is the problem we're trying to solve? Now, I put it to you from the context of women in defence technology. Maybe the problem sounds a little bit like this. Without diversity of thought, we have lame plans. They're not robust enough. They get pressure tested and they get broken. That's what happens when we don't have diversity, because we don't get diversity of thought. And we have an echo chamber with clones of ourselves that come to the same conclusions that what we're building is really good because we surrounded ourselves with people who thought exactly the same way. There's a concept called confirmation bias, where we have a narrative, we latch onto that narrative, and then we start looking for evidence that supports that narrative at the expense of anything that might disprove it. Very dangerous game to play, particularly in the leadership space. So I put it to you as a proposition and as an optimistic way to look forward. Women in defence technology is an incredible way to overcome that confirmation bias. It's not every day my wife asks something that completely comes from left field for me, but with the benefit of hindsight, I look back and I go, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was going a bit rogue there. You know, that's a very valuable thing, because if I didn't have that stopgap, where would we end up? Now, our conflict also needs to be uncomfortable enough, and it needs to feel insurmountable at times, and then we need to achieve it. Looking back on the story of women in defence and the growth of capability, 100 years ago, if they looked at what we're at now, they would have no idea. This concept was insurmountable, yet here we are. What would 100 years look like from now? What could we take this organisation and the broader defence organisation to? What could that look like, and could we articulate it? Now, wherever I go, I preach about the importance of context. I link it fervently to the power of leadership. Leaders own context. That's what they do. They contextualize problems, and they use empathy as a mechanism to link into context. If you look at something without context, it doesn't match. There's a term called a disjunction. It's like when you hear a piano playing and you hear the wrong key jar and you go, oh, that wasn't quite right. The same applies in our narratives and our language. When you talk to someone, but you didn't have the context, we have disjunctions, and it doesn't match. And then suddenly we have that break of rapport. Leaders own context. They own the truth. The next reasonable question is, how does one better articulate the truth? I talked about contextualization. Our resolution is often linked to that lack of context. So if we use the example of romantic comedies, sometimes, or just romance novels in general, Sometimes there's no tension at all in the form of kinetic tension. There's no fights, there's no arguments, there's nothing really happening, really. But what was missing was a piece of information where people came to conclusions that were devoid of that information, and therefore the context was missing. And yet we don't see the resolution until that little piece of information becomes evident and it matches organically back into the story, and then we get that respite that, all right, everyone understands, it was just a misunderstanding, and now we're back where we need to be, right? But that tension can be just as powerful as an action movie, and all it is the removal of context. Well, what that proves is the power of context. As leaders, we need to lean towards context, and if we want to subdivide down, we would say we need to be able to explain why we're doing something, how we're doing something, and the measure of success. What does it look like when we actually get there? Perspective, context, and morals. This is a can of worms, okay, frankly. This is an elephant in the room, and it's a hard conversation to have because everyone feels that they're the good guy in their story. That's the elephant in the room. We believe that we are right and everyone else is wrong, or we are right and they're partly wrong, but it's never us in the first instance. That little voice inside your head talking all the time, the one that I'm competing for attention right now, is constantly blabbering on about God knows what. Right now it's probably like, oh, when's he going to shut up? Is he going to speed up? You know, who's up next? When's morning tea? I should have got a coffee. You know, I couldn't get a park because my car's too tall, whatever, right? That's the thing I'm up against, right? That's the thing you're up against. That's the thing we are up against. Rationalization has no limits. That little voice will say whatever it wants to say, and then it will latch onto that concept of confirmation bias, and it will just go. We can use that. We can use that. Once we know it's there, we can start matching and mirroring off that, and we can use that. That's a pretty awesome idea. Our authors have bias. We all have bias. Biases are evident in the narrative that we choose to latch onto. All right? We start to sense it. Someone who's objective, who is devoid of the context, will look at a narrative and go, that's biased. Like you've latched onto an idea, it's gone too far. Right? Now we're at the point of disjunction. It's not right. It doesn't match what's going on. But conversely, we also have reader bias. Ever read an email, but really you only read 7 words of a 2,000-word email, and they were the words about how you felt at that time? You know, you were pissed off, you woke up, you're angry. It just wasn't a good day. You knocked over your coffee, you couldn't find a park, you banged your toe, your dog barked at you, whatever it was. Right? We got to this point, and now you open up your emails and you're in rage mode. Right? You look at the email, and now everything from this point is rage, and you go, oh my God, straight off, and off we go. Right? It's a dangerous game to play. But now we know about it, we can do something about it. Acknowledge our biases and then use them in our favor. Our memory works in such a way that it doesn't move on from a point until it has a lesson learned. That's what memory's for. It's about learning lessons. Stories help us learn lessons. The whole purpose of story was to create collective lessons. In linking this back to women in defense technology, what are the lessons we learned in defense that we paid a hefty price for? We were a bit slow about getting a very large portion of very capable people into our culture, into our capability, and now we're paying a price for it. The minister just said, it's not good enough. Where we're at, it's not good enough. So we need to speed it up. We need to catch up now. Now we're paying catch up. That's not fun. That's reactive. That's not proactive. Okay? Oops, apologies. I'm going rogue with this thing. It's important that we acknowledge that. Okay? If there's no lessons learned, we will never move on morally. We'll never get the closure. I work a lot with veterans with serious mental health injuries, most notably people who have actually killed themselves or had a very good crack at it. Not a very feel-good topic for the purpose of today, but there's an important lesson to take from it. They will not move on until they've articulated the lesson learnt. If they would do it all again, what would they do differently if put into that same circumstance? Until they can articulate it, they will not move on. Human nature. I mentioned before, nobody ever thinks they're the bad guy. Fair enough. But would we know if we've become the bad guy? And in full disclosure, I ask this of everyone I work with, including my own team. Okay? This is a generic question I ask of everyone. What stopgaps have we got to know, so that we have the assurance that we are in control of our narrative and our message? Would we know? What would be the senses that tell us or indicate to us that maybe we're drifting? We use the analogy of a boat. You might have a boat that gets faster. It can carry more load. It's more efficient on fuel. But what assurance have you got is that the boat is heading in the right direction? This is the generic question we have to ask, and as leaders, we have to dive into that space. Now, in the context of women in defence technology, I'd propose that indicators would be a completely misrepresented room. I don't see that. That's a really good sign. That shows that there is a good linkage of people who want to get behind this and for all the right reasons. Well done. Congratulations to us. Can we sustain and maintain that? I don't know. But at least we're looking for it. No one ever thinks they're the bad guy. All right. Other elephant in the room. No conflict, no growth. If there's no adversity and there's no pressure testing, no one grows out of it. No one gets any better. We just stay where we're at. Now, the elephant in the room is this. Strategically, we're up against some big players. They're the pressure test. If we can't have the question, if we can't dive in to ask the questions that need to be asked at the bottom level, I'll tell you what, we're going to get pressure tested in a pretty significant way, and we might not want the results. Women in defence technology provides an incredible opportunity to link that back into capability and grow us up to a new level. Link it to capability. The narrative is about capability. All right? If we can get that and we can agree as a collective, then we're in a pretty good spot. In the absence of context, people will rationalize their own. It has no limits. Now, to demonstrate the power of rationalization, every person who did a terrible act at one point thought that they were the good guy. They were doing the right thing. Okay? But it didn't just start there. Where it started was they had to listen to that voice, they got to the point of rationalization, and then they went, I'm going to do this thing. They didn't just stop there. They were able to convince other people to do it. And then they didn't just stop there. They were able to convince anyone else that they were the weird one for not doing it. All right? Our rationalization has no limits. All right? But that's what we know we're up against. That's an incredible opportunity. The people we're trying to convince, this is what we're up against as well. All right? Some people are so fervently allocated to a mindset, and we're trying to convince them otherwise. We have to be very prescriptive about how we do that. And frankly, I think how Jenna and the team have approached this particular organization is nothing short of admirable. It's incredibly well represented and for all the right reasons. The elephant in the room is this. If we can't get the narrative right, people will not support us. That's like any organization. Everything we do as an organization, be it commercial, be it a charity, be it a sporting team, is linked to relevance and competence. We must constantly link back to those factors if we're going to be of relevance and competence. I think this is a bloody good start, frankly, and I'm very impressed with where this organization is heading. So I asked the question at the start, who is telling our story and what are they saying? I'd suggest that with the powerhouse that we've got in this room, we're perfectly positioned to tell our story. Or we need to be very prescriptive about how we do it and what's the effect we're actually trying to achieve. At the start, I talked about our 1899 Newsies. Some people are probably on their phones and already know the answer. All right. Our 1899 Newsies caused turmoil. They did their riots, they did their protests. They wanted a reduction of price back down to 50 cents, and they didn't get it. They didn't achieve it. But what they did achieve was a buyback scheme. The newspapers were hampered so much by these children that they went back to the negotiation board and said, we'll create a buyback scheme. And so people could read their newspaper and sell it back for a nominal fee. In doing so, they created a new financial ecosystem and constrained system in the sense that people could now recycle newspapers. The newspaper didn't need to produce as many. That was good for them, and from a production perspective, the Newsies were able to recycle the paper, so they didn't have to keep logistically going and getting more new newspapers, and everybody won. Great outcome. This would not have happened if a 13-year-old with an eye patch hadn't pushed back. We need to push back sometimes. We need to ask the awkward questions. And when we do, we grow. But we need a lot of courage and bravery to do that. And a 13-year-old with a bunch of ragtag, impoverished children yelling at people on street corners, we were able to stop two of the biggest organisations on the planet in a couple of weeks, no less. Women in defence technology has an amazing future ahead of it. Thank you for everyone who bothered to come here today. It speaks volumes about your character, about your intent, and your support to the country. And from me to you, thank you very much for your time. I hope that was a bit of fun and something a little bit different from today's agenda. All the best.